Welcome to this live review show. The Seahawks fall to the Rams 26-20 in overtime last night, despite outgaining the Rams 424 yards to 366, despite the defense looking like a competent unit, especially against the run, holding the Rams to 68 yards rushing, holding them to 3 out of 13 on third downs. They picked off Matt Stafford, made him look mortal, at least until the overtime period. They blocked a punt inside the 20-yard line. They beat the Rams in time of possession. Geno Smith threw for 363 yards and 3 touchdowns. They handed the ball to Kenneth Walker 25 times and had a wide receiver go for 180 yards and 2 touchdowns, and yet they don't come out with a win. Thanks to, among other things, a missed extra point. 3 extremely costly interceptions from Smith. 12 more penalties on this team, including some which took huge gains and points off the board. Honestly, the most maddening loss of the season. We're going to break it all down for you. It drops the Seahawks to 4-5. They are alone in last place now in the NFC West. But coming up on this live edition of Seahawks Forever, powered by BetUS, Bryce Coutts of the HawkZone Rundown is going to join me for a joint therapy session analysis. We're going to break this thing down. And as the thumbnail shows you, we're going to focus on the positives because I think there are many of them, but we won't shy away from the negative. We'll take a look at everything coming up next on this edition of Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
All right, you guys head on over to BetUS right now. Sign up for your new account, and they will give you a 150% sign-up bonus on your first deposit, 125% on your second and third deposits if you use the promo code YouTube150. Obviously, no Seahawks game this week on the bye week, but they have live betting on all games in the NFL and all pro sports. And as soon as we get past the weekend, they'll have prop bets and point spread for the Seahawks traveling to San Francisco coming out of the break. All right, let's bring in Bryce Coutts to add to the show. Bryce, Ryan feeling a little under the weather today, not able to go. I was questionable myself heading into the game. Had an ankle injury that's feeling a lot better now. But whoops, where'd you go? There you are. Got to keep my hand away from the mouse. Was it because of the game? Is Ryan just feeling hungover from the ups and downs of this one?
I wish that was the case, but yeah, he was in some pretty rough shape. We were supposed to have a show yesterday, and he texted me even before the game, and he goes, "Hey man, like I can't do it. I got to go on the IR for the game or the PUP list." But he'll be back in the week.
Yeah,
inactive
list.
Inactive list.
Yeah,
You want to call
still
it
on the active roster.
Yeah, he's still on the active roster. Exactly.
The way this is going to work, we're gonna kind of give our thoughts and analysis on the game. I'm gonna pick your brain about how you saw some of the things that happened from a coaching perspective because of your background in that. And then we'll take a break about halfway through, and then we'll come back with your comments and questions. So no matter whether you're watching on my YouTube channel or Bryce's, we're streaming to both, the HawkZone Rundown channel as well, or my Facebook or my Twitter, wherever you send your comments and questions will show up in our combined feed, and we'll be able to put those on the screen and address some of those for you. Let's do this first. This is where I want to start because I do want to focus on some of the positives first. And 2 things stand out to me. The first one was that from the very first snap yesterday, this defense looked different. It especially looked different against the run, and they did it against a team that's committed to the run, almost has a 50-50 split in run pass. Sean McVay loves to lean on the run as much as he's known for kind of being a passing guru. What did you notice that they were doing differently yesterday? There was a lot of talk during the week about assignments, about skinnying up the playbook, about alignment. Why were they so much better yesterday?
I think a big part for them being so much better yesterday, Dan, was the fact that they did go back to the basics. It seemed like in a lot of ways there wasn't as much exotic, blitzes and stuff like that, or simulation of blitzes. They, especially the run game, they fit their gap responsibilities properly. And you could see, like, yes, coming out of that second half, The Rams got a bit of a running game going, but overall, like if you look at the stats, they had 24 carries for 68 yards and average 2 yards a carry. That's a winning recipe on defense for stopping the run. You're not allowing explosive plays where it's, where we were seeing runs of 30 yards and, 20 plus yards that were gashing us. They fit the run really well. And they stayed true to their assignments. You could see that there wasn't as much confusion on the defense this week.
Yeah, and it was evident from early on, that Buffalo game is the worst example, I think, of just, time and time again, every single time Josh Allen handed the ball off, the Buffalo offensive line was pushing the Seahawks defenders back 4 or 5 yards. It was James Cook had such a runway to work with. That wasn't happening yesterday. It reminded me of some of those really solid Pete Carroll run defenses that with some of those defensive lines that weren't stacked with superstars, guys like Red Bryant and some of those other guys on the inside to go along with, Michael Bennett in his prime and some of those players. But it looked completely different, and it gave them a chance early on.
Yeah, no, it definitely did. And here's another point of it too, is like we look at the Buffalo game. They gave up 11 rushing first downs in that game. This game, they gave up 4 rushing first downs. That's a recipe for success. And as we know of having played Sean McVay and the way his offense operates, they really work well off of the play action. While your run game's not going, it's hard to sell the defense on it being a believable threat. So you could see that some of his play action concepts weren't there this game that they've been in the past. Like, honestly, that was probably one of the best defensive performances we've seen against a Sean McVay team, where they've held them scoreless an entire quarter in the beginning of the game. Usually McVay's teams are very fast starting. They get going. Defense did well. Mike McDonald did well yesterday when it came to getting this defense readjusted.
Now, the other huge positive to come out of yesterday, and then we'll kind of dial it back and talk about some of the issues that led to the loss, certainly, and are the biggest concern. But really, there's no other way to look at it than Jackson Smith and Jigba's true breakout game. 7 catches, 180 yards, 2 touchdowns. Had, I think, another 80 yards in receptions called back because of penalties. And the way that they used him was different than we've ever seen. Obviously, DK Metcalf not being able to go again yesterday gave the opportunity for that. But it wasn't just that. The week before, we didn't see this out of Ryan Grubb and Jackson Smith and Jigba. But he was really the best player on the field for the Seahawks offense yesterday.
He absolutely was. And it was nice to see that they figured out that he could run routes past 8 yards down the field. And that was something like, and that's the thing, he is such a smooth route runner that you want to exploit that and use that when it comes to those deeper patterns where he can put moves on a defensive back or a safety who generally aren't the most coverage sound guy as safeties. That's the reason they are safety, so they can kind of play just a general area of the defense. You look at where they started to run him and some of the stuff. He was over 10 yards for most of his catches. He had a couple underneath, but mainly they were getting him the ball down the field. And you saw some of that run after catch that he's been, that we've heard about, and the yak and all that. You saw that come to life in this game. I think one of my favorite plays I think actually got called back was when the Seahawks were third and 19 or something, and they ran a little tunnel screen to him, and he took it and shot up the field and got them to or it was 2nd and 19, sorry, and got them to 3rd and 8 basically, and made something happen. Yeah, it was nice to see JS. Now the question is, Dan, they have to figure out how to keep this going. It can't just be a flash in the pan like that New England game where we saw this 12 targets and all this, and then he disappears and goes back into being, 5 targets for, 10 yards.
Well, and my thoughts on that are, and I've been saying this for a while, and I'm a huge proponent of DK Metcalf, been on the record as saying that for a long time. I think he's a unique player. He's a unique talent, but he's limited. There are flaws to his game. There's a ceiling. There's certain things that he doesn't do well. In my world, I would have this be the focal point of the offense and have DK be the complementary piece. That may sound crazy to people because they're going to say, but salary, but I don't care. Look at some of the other teams. They look at Miami with Waddle and Tyreek Hill, right? They're both getting huge top of the market money just because they're good players and they want to keep their good players and they're essential to their offense. But for this offense to function the way I'd like to see it, use DK on the tough middle of the field stuff. He's so good at those in-breaking routes and those digs, and he can catch balls in traffic and against really good defenders, even if he doesn't get a lot of separation. Obviously, you want to send him deep when you can. But do this with Jackson Smith and Jigba and kind of have him try at least to get defenses to think that he's just as much of a focal point of the offense as DK is.
I think that's where, if they can replicate what they did with JSN in this game and add DK's ability to take the top off of defense, to force defenses to back up, that's where you're going to see JSN, I think, truly come into his own. Because what it seemed like to me for the first, I guess 6 weeks of the season or 7 weeks of the season was they wanted Tyler to kind of have this role. And this is what has always kind of been Tyler's role, is as the complementary to DK is, I'm going to run these kind of deeper mid target range routes, and JSN's going to be our true underneath guy. I think those roles need to be switched. I think you need to see JSN do this and complement DK's side of him being the guy. If DK gets 7 targets in a game or 8 targets, but he's getting 90 yards because they're deep shots down the field on, posts and goes and comebacks, and he's able to tilt the defense the way that we know DK does just by his sheer presence.
Yeah.
That's going to allow, I think, for JSN to see a lot more of this going forward.
Now let's take a look at this, because while it wasn't a dynamic performance in the run game, the effort was there. And I thought there were moments where I thought that we were seeing a little bit of what we saw early in the San Francisco game, where it was a little bit, they went a little too far early in the game trying to establish the run. You could see from the first carry of the game, I think it was a 5 or 6 yard gain from Kenneth Walker. You could see the offensive line getting a little bit more push. He was running physical. You can see from this chart, 25 carries, only 83 yards, but they stuck with it. I saw some indications on Twitter that some people were frustrated. They got away from it in the fourth quarter. I think some of that was game script. Some of it was because Geno got a hot hand late, and some of it was clock management. But they never really abandoned it. They stuck with it throughout the game. It just, the holes weren't there. We're certainly going to talk about the offensive line in a minute. But I thought maybe of the 9 games they've played so far, this was the most consistently throughout the game that they've stuck with the run, even when it wasn't really working.
Yeah, it definitely was. The thing that I liked when I watched their run game, even though it didn't show off any big explosive runs, really, as you can see by the chart you've got up on the screen there, they kind of changed how they started attacking teams.
Sorry, let me do this.
They went to more of what looked like a gap and duo blocking system in there, which instead of being the wide zone run team that they kind of been previously this season and trying to stretch teams and get K9 outside, they started trapping, countering, pulling guys, running downhill. And you can see that in the chart here. It's a very much more condensed chart of attack.
Mm-hmm.
And it did hold the linebackers in there, which then you can see on JSN's chart, that middle of the field target area, he was getting at 10 plus yards is because linebackers were staying up and they were worried about this run attack. Even though it wasn't giving the huge amount of yards, it was still a consistent factor.
Yeah, it was a threat. The Rams had to respect it. He had a number of runs of over 5 yards. That really hasn't happened lately. And I thought this reminded me of the second half of Walker's rookie year. The first half, I was critical of him for just dancing too much, trying to bounce everything to the outside. There was a real concerted effort to try to get him to run more between the tackles in the second half of his rookie year. And I thought we saw the results of that. This reminded me a little bit of that. Man, I thought he ran hard.
He did. He did really run hard. And the thing that I also found that was really interesting is Charbonnet only touched it twice. They didn't really mix these two in this game, which they had done in the past. They really strictly stuck with K9. And you know what? He needs touches. He needs to be involved in this offense. And that's the only way, sometimes it's not going to be pretty. It's going to be they averaged 3.2 yards a carry. Yeah, they did give they had 33 carries in total for the game, 25 to K9. That's not a bad stat. 83 yards, if you can keep a defense honest, you can keep a defense honest. Sometimes it just isn't pretty when you do it.
Yeah, I know there was a lot of fans calling for more Charbonnet, especially late in the game, especially in overtime when they had the 3rd and 1 and the 4th and 1 that failed. I don't know if it would have made much of a difference because of the blocking. So let's address the elephant in the room before we get to and talk about some quarterback play. This may have been, and this is a high bar, man, but this was the worst performance for this offensive line this year. I think I saw today it was almost a 60% pressure rate. The fact that Geno was able to get as many big plays as he did was pretty remarkable, despite the mistakes. We were excited about George Fant being healthy. Mike McDonald talked about how great he looked. In fact, at one point he said he looked really good this week. No, he looked great. He corrected himself. And yet, once again, he couldn't make it out of the first quarter because of that knee. I don't know if he's going to end up on IR or not. Mike McDonald didn't have any updates today. But we saw Mike Jarrell come in again, the 6th-round draft pick out of Findlay. And as much as we all thought he played well against the Falcons in his debut, I think we can see that now. Hindsight being 2020, that held his own might be a little bit more accurate phrase against a team that's near the bottom of the league in pressure percentage and sacks. Maybe a soft landing for him. Really, really struggled yesterday. And when you add that to the fact that Anthony Bradford, once again, even though he was handed publicly the right guard spot full time yesterday, to the point that Christian Haynes wasn't even active for the game, that those two in particular, that right side of the offensive line, just couldn't get anything done.
I really, Dan, and I'm going to say this, I think that was the worst offensive line showing in probably the last 10 years, that game. Really, truly was. When you're talking about a 60% pressure rate, you're talking about 3.2 yards a carry on 25 carries. I don't know what else to say about this other than they have utterly failed at building an offensive line in Seattle. And this is the thing, is it was masked for years. It was like they put lipstick on a pig essentially for a couple of years when it came to, Russell being here and in his prime. Yeah. But Russell made those things look better than what they were because of the fact he could move. Geno is not going to do the things Russell's done. And that's where I feel like John Schneider has failed this offensive line. And in the game, Anthony Bradford, we had 7 sacks. He accounted for 6 of them. And 9 of the 12 penalties were on Anthony Bradford. He literally shot Seattle in the foot offensively more than any other player outside of, everyone's going to talk about the interceptions from Geno, which I'm sure we'll get to. But Anthony Bradford did more to destroy Seattle's offensive momentum than Geno did in a lot of ways. And the fact that you scratched Haynes, and then today, I don't know if you heard on Mike McDonald's presser, but he basically said if players take a step back,
then
they're going to be scratched.
Yeah.
So you're telling us your 3rd-round pick that you had in a rotation to start had such a step back that he's now scratched from being a healthy scratch. It's kind of mind-boggling to me, and that's even more of a concern of did you guys scout this player? What is going on here? There's no fix. That's the thing. There's no we can go and trade for a guy. I'm sure there's talks of it. That's not going to solve this problem this year. They need to aggressively overhaul this entire offensive line. And saying that, if Abe Lucas comes back, it's going to solve it. Abe Lucas is not solving the interior of this offensive line. Connor Williams played bad.
Oh, we're going to talk about him. I mean, but yeah, you make a great point. Anthony Bradford didn't win that right guard job. That's what we thought the indication was when he made the comments before the game that moving forward, he was going to be the guy. Now, based on the comments we heard today, it was Haynes lost it. And, you can blame the scouting department. Did they miss on this guy? Christian Haynes, I did it again yesterday. I went and looked at all the pre-draft profiles of this guy from some of the most respected people in the business, the Dane Bruglers and the Lance Zierleins. And they all agreed this guy's a starter in the NFL and a really good one. Maybe a little undersized, but extremely experienced and versatile. But you mentioned earlier that they were running more gap power stuff. You can see it from the Kenneth Walker run chart. But all those same draft profiles that I saw said that Haynes was a better fit in an outside zone scheme. Connor Williams is more known for his athletic ability, his ability to get to outside zone and to reach block and to get to the second level than he is for power. We're certainly seeing that. He's getting absolutely bullied by some of these defensive lines. Could it be a situation where they just don't have the right, these might be good players. And if you put them on other rosters, they might play okay. Right. And we might look back like we have in past years with guys like Ethan Posick and Mark Glowinski. Oh, I guess that guy wasn't a terrible player after all, where it's just a bad fit because they don't have the right players to run the scheme that they want to run.
I think that's part of it. I do. And that again, I think, falls at the feet of John Schneider because he handpicked this staff and he's had the most say in this roster building process. And the thing that drives me a bit nuts here, Dan, is they keep talking how they want to be a tough physical team in the trenches. That's what we want to be. We want to be tough and physical. They have built a finesse football team. You have more money and more allocation to your skill positions than to the area that you say and keep publicly saying that you want to be really great at. You look at a Baltimore Ravens team, or even what Jim Harbaugh is now doing with the Chargers, they traded away skill position to build an offensive line. The Baltimore Ravens have built offensive lines. And to me, it's just, we go and get a Lincoln Tomlinson in free agency because we spend money on a pass catching tight end that we don't feature in our offense and Noah Fant. We, grab a Christian Haynes in the third round, but don't run a scheme that fits his skill set. Like we can't seem to figure it out. It's like we're playing chess or checkers and everyone else is playing chess and we just can't figure out how to play the game. Like, I don't know what you do, but I think there is some scheme issues here. And I think Ryan Grubb and Scott Huff are kind of sitting there going, what do we throw at the wall? What combination of linemen that we have do we throw together to try and get something going? And I wonder how much longer you start Connor Williams at center.
That's what I was just going to ask you is like, how bad would it have to get for them to admit that they made a mistake and give one of these other guys a try? Ola Watimi didn't give up a single sack his last season at Michigan. His pass protection was outstanding, and he's known more as a gap guy, more of a power guy. Schneider talked about how stout he was on draft night. Then he is a guy that can get to the second level. Or if you want to run some of that zone stuff, they clearly like Jalen Sundell, undrafted free agent out of North Dakota State, South Dakota State, North Dakota State.
One of the Dakota
states.
Yeah, one of those Dakota states.
They obviously like him enough. They kept him on the 53. They've had him active over Ola Watimi all season long. They brought him in on some unbalanced line, eligible tackle stuff yesterday. Like, how bad would it have to get for them to say, okay, this isn't working, he's part of the problem, let's try someone else?
I don't know if it gets much worse, Dan. Realistically, like, I think they're at rock bottom here. Like, you need to figure this out. This bye week, you truly need these next 2 weeks or 10 days or whatever you want to call it. They need to sit down and go, okay, what do we do somewhat well and just commit to it and go with it. And that's where, for me, what's so shocking about, Ryan Grubb and Scott Huff coming over from Washington is they, I think, misjudged this offensive line. And that's what's worrisome is Scott Huff had spent 7 years at the University of Washington, built some great offensive lines there. How do you walk in and look at this talent just because they're in the pros and assume that they're a good group? Like, did you not watch the film of where this team struggled and how they struggled? And, okay, if you guys are going to commit to a certain style, like, it's almost like they can't commit to a style. Do we want to be wide outside zone? Do we want to be gap and duo power? Like, they need to commit to something and be it and go to it and just dive into it and run it. It's like, don't keep going half-ass in and half-ass out, because if you do that, you're just running into the exact problem we're running into now, which is a absolutely pathetic offensive line.
Well, they better figure it out quick, because going into the bye week now, they are in last place. I mean, everything's still jumbled up. There's still, everything on the table. The Cardinals now all alone in first place at 5-4. And they're a team that seems to be improving every week. The Rams improved to 4-4 after a 1-4 start, 3 straight wins for them. The Seahawks now with 4 straight home losses as well. And the 49ers coming off their bye at 4-4, but they're going to get Christian McCaffrey back. I mean, this is getting to a point where if you have any designs on being a playoff team now, like, you got to make the most of this bye week and come back and that first game down at Santa Clara, coming out of the bye and facing the San Francisco 49ers, is never a comfortable matchup anyway for the Seahawks over the last 5 years. But that's now you're facing a must-win situation. Is this, I thought this week, the whole sunk cost thing was promising. right? I think it was Mike McDonald acknowledging, like, look, I have to dial back what I'm giving these guys. We need to realize what we are. Now they'll get a 2-week chance to look at that. But is there anything that they can do in the short term to fix this offensive line? You can talk about getting the ball out quicker, right? You can talk about trying to protect your guys instead of leaving them on an island. I saw a stat last week. The Seahawks are among the league leaders in leaving their guys on an island, which works for the most part for Charles Cross, but not for whoever's playing right tackle, and yet it seems like they're hesitant to add tight ends on that side or do a lot of unbalanced line stuff. Like, as a guy who is a quarterback coach, owns a quarterback academy, is a coach, and your specialty is offense, you're an offensive coordinator. Like, is there anything this team can do short of major acquisitions, schematically or coaching wise, to try to make up or cover up this weakness so that they can be competitive?
I think the biggest thing, like, to help their pass protection, they have to be able to run the ball more effectively and impactfully. And that's the biggest thing here. So if I'm sitting there in the coach's room, it's okay, what can we actually run? And if that means you have to cut back your playbook and you might need to get a little bit more creative in how you create mismatches and angles for your run scheme, and whether you're pulling guys, whether you're duoing with, running a zone scheme, but having your tight end help set that edge with the offensive tackle. The one thing that's kind of disappeared from this offense is jet sweeps. Like, you need to pull the defense out a little bit, like get Laviska Shenault involved, not throw it to him, literally have him come across and take it and go.
Yeah.
The, bubble, it takes so long to develop sometimes. The jet, where he just comes across and takes it and goes, and then you can run the jet draw off of it to K9. There's some things you can do. You're not going to fix this problem, and they're not going to jump up to being a mid-ranked offensive line, but you have to establish an effective running game. Just if you run it, like, we were talking about K9's performance, 25 carries, 83 yards, but the problem is 3.2 yards a carry. That doesn't threaten the defense to get out of anything that they're doing. They're like, oh, you'll get 3 runs and you're still short of a first down, essentially. Yeah. You're 4th and 1. And as we found out, Seattle can't get 1 yard even if they try their hardest. But that's kind of what you have to do at this point. If I'm sitting there as the offensive coordinator, I have to dial things back, like way back. And the other thing that doesn't help this is you have basically a pocket quarterback. But that's what Geno is. He can move and he can make space in the pocket, but he's not doing the stuff that Russ does or Lamar Jackson does or Josh Allen does, where a defender's coming free and he's able to scoot out and extend the play and throw it down the field. So with that being said, you need to have play action. But the thing that drives me nuts with Seattle is they don't go under center enough. And I know people say, oh, well, there's a million, they can't block. If you're under center and that ball is instantly in your quarterback's hand from snap, and that running back is running downhill, it is a lot faster of a play than if you're waiting for a ball to be snapped back to you 5 or 6 yards deep in the
if
pocket.
It gets to you. Yeah,
exactly. That's the other point. If it gets to you to begin with,
man,
they have to dial it back, and they have to get back to fundamentals on how they're going to block. Find the guys that understand their assignment the best and put them in there. Don't go off of what their physicality look is or anything. If Connor Williams can't create, good snaps consistently and is struggling to get out of his stance, put Sundell in there. See what he does. Move Olo to a guard spot and see if maybe he can play a guard spot. Like, mix and match and see. The only steady thing you've got is Charles Cross. All other 4 positions are a rotating door until you find something that works.
Yeah. Do you see signs? Because he's taking a lot of heat right now. A lot of heat. And justifiably so. I understand it. Do you see signs, though, that Ryan Grubb is or can be a good NFL coordinator?
I was high on Grubb when he got hired. He wasn't my first choice. My first choice, sadly, is coaching Pittsburgh. I actually did really want Arthur Smith here.
Yeah.
But Ryan Grubb was my number 2. And I thought Ryan Grubb was going to be able to come over. And the thing for me that excited me the most about Ryan Grubb is his O-line history. Like, he is an O-line coach at heart. That's what he came into college football as.
Yeah.
At Eastern Michigan. And they had one of the best rushing attacks there.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's like, as soon as he got together with Kalen DeBoer at Fresno State and got into being an OC, and that it kind of is like he forgot his roots in a way, it seems. Because even with Washington, yes, Dylan Johnson last year had a lot of, success running the football, but again, they're running behind one of the best offensive lines that was already built there prior to him getting there. Yeah. It wasn't like he built it up. And so when him and Huff came over, I was of the impression like, hey, they're going to be able to identify there's a lot of issues here. They need to push John Schneider to go and be aggressive and bring in some guys. And it didn't happen. And I kind of went, okay, maybe they see something, maybe. Now 9 games in, which is a pretty decent sample size, there's some things that I like that Ryan Grubb does with his vertical passing game and his concepts. But things that worry me is his inability to create balance, an effective balance in the offense. And I get the offensive line's an issue, but as an offensive coordinator, you need to have some answers to that. You've had training camp, preseason, everything to identify those.
Yeah.
So I honestly think, and this may be a hot take, but I think Ryan Grubb is truly auditioning for his year 2 over these last set of games this season.
It's funny, the more this season goes along, the more I think it kind of reminds me of Pete Carroll's first season here. And that's hard to admit because I think there's more talent here than Pete inherited. I can't remember the number now, but there was something like 250 roster moves or something they made that first season, just continually churning the back end of that roster, trying to find players. But 7-9 got him into the playoffs because the division was down and it gave him an opportunity. If the 49ers were performing, if they were healthy, first of all, and they were performing at a level we expected, this thing might already be over because you look around the rest of the NFC and a wild card might be out of reach too. It's pretty remarkable how you can kind of compare and contrast those two things. And also in the same way that when Pete was hired, I've replayed this press conference before. He stood at the podium the day he was introduced and told us exactly how he was going to play football. And it included being physical and running the football and being able to dictate terms. But he wasn't able to do that until they traded for Marshawn Lynch. But they had a better offensive line at the time too. They had more money invested in it. So it's, we've seen offensive coordinators one and done. It was Jeremy Bates that first year for Carroll, just didn't match up with what he wanted to do. And so they cut him loose after the first year. As far as position coaches go, it has been said, I've had people suggest to me that like maybe we're not giving them enough heat for some of the performances, some of these guys. Carl Scott has this great reputation, but yet we're seeing Reek Woolen make these mistakes time after time and some of the coverage issues. How much accountability can some of these defensive coaches have? It's not all on Mike Macdonald, right? He's coaching the coaches.
No, and that's one thing too. Like I think Carl Scott, I don't know. Well, here's the thing with Carl Scott. He's done a phenomenal job with Kobe Bryant.
Yeah.
Kobe Bryant.
Great point. He looked good again yesterday.
He looked phenomenal yesterday again. Like he flies around. That hit he laid, I was sitting there going, and in the new NFL, we're going to get a penalty for that. And they picked it up. And I watched it, and it literally reminded me of Earl and Cam. When you used to see, like I had flashbacks of Vernon Davis down the sideline. He timed it so well, hit the guy clean, didn't lead with his helmet, and created an impactful play. And he was also around the ball. Like the one thing I've noticed since Kobe's come in, we don't seem to be giving up, minus obviously the Reek Woolen overtime play, as many outside deep shot plays. He seems to be around the ball, closing up gaps, flying down, helping in the run. But then you, like you said, you look at Reek Woolen, like that. The Reek Woolen should have had two interceptions yesterday.
Yeah.
He got lazy on that other one. He let the guy come right in front of him, like attack the ball. You're a receiver, like by trade in college. That's what you were before you switched.
Yep.
You should have been able to make that play. And it seems to me, again, since Reek's come back from this injury, he looks more like year 2 Reek than he did the first couple weeks of the season, where he looked like year 1 rookie Reek, where we were like, wow, like we've got a steal. Like he's kind of Jekyll and hiding this season again, and that's concerning.
Yeah, the game winner even is another great example of maybe just his lack of development or maybe a blind spot in his game right now, where the Seahawks are in cover 0, something McDonald doesn't do that much, and he gets caught peeking into the backfield, and that allows the receiver to get behind him. Just because of his sheer speed, he ends up catching up, and he's in position to make a play at the end, but he obviously doesn't. Back to the offensive side of things, the Seahawks are one of the only teams that I could find that doesn't have the title of run game coordinator given to anybody. would that make sense? I mean, I'm as I sit here, and I would assume that you know more about this. I don't really even understand how that role fits in with what the offensive coordinator does, but most teams have one, and a lot of those guys go on to get coordinator jobs. The Seahawks had one. Andy Dickerson was run game coordinator and offensive line coach. Before that, they had some other guys. Would that be something maybe that bring in a guy who's, if you're gonna bring Ryan Grubb back, right? Because as you mentioned, that the dynamic things that he can do in the passing game are pretty evident when the quarterback gets time to throw, even when he doesn't sometimes. But the struggles in the run game, would it make sense to maybe bring in a guy just to focus on that?
It's funny because usually most staffs I've been a part of that have had the two coordinators, usually your run game coordinator is your O-line or tight ends coach. Usually that's his second title. Is that something like Scott Huff, I would have assumed would have had that title as run game coordinator. Now, if he's not comfortable with it, then yeah, I think it's definitely something you have to look at going forward, because having someone like the run game coordinator, and this is where, people look at the offensive coordinator and they assume he looks at everything. Sometimes what you have with your two coordinators is they are coaching their positional coaches beneath them, where your head coach more coaches your coordinators, and then your coordinators kind of delegate down to your positional coaches. So like on my staff, I'll walk around offensive practice and kind of keep eyes on everything that's going on and kind of give my 2 cents on what I want done here or how I want this to look. But I let my positional coaches coach that. And so I have a run game and a pass game coordinator. I've had those before. And hey, we're in Skelly. That guy's running my Skelly period of 7-on-7. If we're an inside run, my run game coordinator is running that. And I'm looking at it all as a big picture and seeing if we're getting the stuff we need to get in done. So that's something I definitely think they may need to look at, is bringing in a veteran guy that's a run game coordinator that can help guide maybe Scott Huff and Ryan Grubb. But the problem I have with that too, Dan, is that is then an indictment on John Schneider's coach hiring this offseason. You hire two guys that were so inexperienced. You need to bring in a veteran coach to fix it, because I feel like if you had hired an Arthur Smith, for an example, that's a guy that knows how the NFL works and knows what he needs and what he doesn't need. And that's where I'm kind of getting this worry with Grubb, is I don't know if Grubb knows what he needs and what he doesn't need.
Yeah, like I'm starting to wrap my head around the idea that maybe for a roster and a team that was, we all thought, built for and intent on being good and contending and not rebuilding, maybe it was just too much new, right? Too many first-time coaches to either that position. Mike McDonald obviously has never had that responsibility, or to the NFL. And that did we maybe underestimate how that transition was going to be, how hard that was going to be?
I think that's part of it. And I have talked to a few people now to verify something. Ryan Grubb was not a Mike McDonald hire. Arthur Smith was who he wanted, but because McDonald and the way that Seattle took so long to get going in the hiring process, Arthur Smith didn't want to wait and lose out if McDonald didn't get the Seattle job and be kind of in no man's land. So he jumped on the Steelers job, but that is actually who Mike McDonald really wanted to be his offensive coordinator, because of Arthur Smith was hated on so much for his inability to get Kyle Pitts involved in Atlanta.
Right.
And that whole thing down there with that team. But if you look at what Arthur Smith did as a coordinator, again, different role entirely, as a coordinator in Tennessee, that running game and the way he revived Ryan Tannehill and the stuff that he was able to do, he made games easy for Ryan Tannehill. I remember times we looked at Ryan Tannehill and thought he was a top 10 quarterback because he had such easy reads and throws to make to not really great receivers, but that's because of how effective their run game and offensive line was for him. You can kind of see that there's something not connecting there with Ryan Grubb and Mike McDonald that I think would have potentially been connected between Arthur Smith and Mike McDonald in their view of how to run offense.
If you're just tuning in, hit that subscribe button, and all the other ways to support the show are down below. Same on Bryce's side. And if you're new to, or if you're from my channel and one of my viewers and subscribers and you haven't watched the HawkZone Rundown, definitely check those guys out. Bryce is going to have a show later tonight with Mookie Alexander from Field Goals as well. Give those guys a sub. They're closing in on 1,000. Really want to help them get there. Two things, and then we're going to get to a quick break, and then we'll do viewer questions and comments. So if you're just tuning in, or if you're sitting there watching, get your comments in, and we'll get to those the second half of the show. If you're sitting there watching and you're getting a little upset because we're not talking about the two things that the most people are pissed off about today. let's talk about them now, right? The two villains in this game, it would seem that the majority of people are holding accountable for this are John Schneider and Geno Smith. We'll get to Geno in a minute. Obviously, you have a unique perspective when it comes to quarterbacks. John Schneider is a guy that, he was sitting right there in lockstep with Pete Carroll, got us a Super Bowl, got a lot of credit for building rosters, finding Russell Wilson, finding the Legion of Boom and all those guys and identifying talent. And he's such a likable dude. I mean, I have a hard time sometimes holding him to the fire just because I've interacted with him enough personally. We have a really good rapport. I just like the guy, right? And that does make it a little bit harder. Sometimes it's a little bit easier if you're separated from the situation. But you can't look at this roster and where this team is right now and not put the performance of the offensive line squarely on his shoulders.
Yeah, I'm becoming more and more frustrated with how John Schneider has basically neglected the offensive line. And people will go, oh, well, he's put so much draft capital and all this stuff into it. And it was a really interesting quote I had heard from Mike Holmgren about his tenure in Seattle when he was GM and coach. And he said, I should never have spent on defensive players in free agency. That's what he did. He was known for it at that time.
Right.
And I used to go young on linemen and stuff in the draft. And he's like, yes, I hit on Walter Jones and Steve Hutchinson. But he goes, guys that I brought in, veteran O-linemen, Robbie Toback, Chris Gray, guys that I brought in solidified that O-line. And he goes, you spend money on offense, you draft for defense. And the reason he said it is because you look at what Pete Carroll, in a way, and John Schneider did do initially in Seattle. They had Max Unger. They did draft a young left tackle, but then they went out and got a Beno Giacomini, and they got some offensive linemen and built a offensive line that worked then and spent money because it was the highest paid offensive line in 2013 when we won our Super Bowl was Seattle's. They went cheap on defense. You get guys that are hungry on defense, the Cam Chancellors. You get guys that are later round picks that are able to come in and make an impact. And so when I look at what John Schneider's done since then, when Justin Britt is the only guy you have given a second contract to,
yeah,
out of the entirety you've been here, you let Okun walk, you let J.R. Sweezy walk, you let all these guys walk out the door, but you give Justin Britt, and it was on Justin Britt's third positional change that he got that second contract because he was a tackle to then guard. Okay, you don't work at those two. I guess we got to try you at center. And he was okay. And then once he got the contract, his play went downhill again. It's a real indictment on the scouting department, John Schneider, their pro development department. Like, you are failing epically at building an offensive line. And it's not like you got to be aggressive with it. You can't just wait because you can see the rest of the NFL has identified, hey, guards are important. Like, what did Kansas City do when they lost their Super Bowl to Tampa Bay? Oh, let's go get Joe Thuney. Let's go get the best left guard.
Oh, they completely tore that line apart after
exactly after one failed Super Bowl. They tore it apart.
Yeah.
We've been sitting here for 10 years and we haven't torn it down enough and actually gone and allocated the correct resources to it. And so for me, when I look at Geno Smith getting a 60% pressure rate on him, and you have a pocket quarterback,
unheard of.
I literally take my finger and I point at John Schneider and go, this is on you, what is occurring on the field. And I hope Jody Allen and Burt Cole are doing the same thing and going, hey, John, you told us you were going to get this fixed. What's the plan to get this fixed this offseason? Like, if I'm Seattle, there shouldn't be one, like, Charles Cross is maybe the only guy that you give him his fifth-year option. But other than that, I don't think you extend Charles Cross necessarily. You don't give him you put him on his fifth-year option and you say, hey, we got to see you perform another year, and we're rebuilding the rest of this O-line. Like, I mean, gut this down to the studs and rebuild it some way. And that doesn't mean, oh, we're going to do it in the draft. If it turns out to be we're going to get another Lincoln Tomlinson at $3 million or whatever it is, that's not going to solve your problem.
Yeah. Yeah, you got to get some dudes. And really great column from Seaside Joe last week about how some of the other organizations, Philadelphia Eagles being one of them, that have successfully year after year had a good offensive line. They've done it in a very specific way, and that's a mix of veterans and young guys. And most of the veterans acquired through free agency, unless you already had a guy in place that you drafted high or whatever and became a Pro Bowl type player. And then your depth is young guys, equal out some of the salary cap implications, but also to develop guys for later that they can, as those guys move on, you can develop those behind some of that experience. And so I think the young guys are in place. No more drafting guys unless it's in the first round, unless it's an elite talent and you have a guy that you know is going to be a day one absolute hands down starter, right? If the Byron Murphy version or Devin Witherspoon version of an offensive lineman falls to you, absolutely go that way. But we've had enough of that. There's, as you said, tons of young players on this offensive line, and they protected them all on the 53, maybe at the expense of some other positions, right? And not to give up on those guys. There's still, you've said on the show before that the coaching staff really likes Satawa Lamea. Clearly, they don't think he's ready yet. I'm not ready to give up on Mike Jarrell. He's just not ready yet. We don't know really what we have in Jalen Sundell as a center, but I saw a lot of upside there in the preseason. So maybe those pieces are kind of in place. You have to go out this offseason and spend some money on an offensive line. And if people are skeptical, I understand it. But think about where the defensive line on this team was 3 years ago and how they essentially did what you just referred to Kansas City doing after the Super Bowl with the defensive line. Essentially showed them all the door and completely rebuild it in one offseason plus the Leonard Williams and Byron Murphy acquisitions, right? And now depth-wise and talent-wise, it's one of the stronger position groups on the team. There's still some time. There's about 24 hours left in the trade deadline, right? Would you be shocked if the Seahawks did not make a move in that area tomorrow?
It depends on what their discussions have been on where they actually view this team is, Dan, and if they still think it's a playoff contending team. Me, if I'm sitting in the general manager seat, I'm a seller at this point. That's how I view this. After that 49ers game, you and me were texting back and forth. I view us more as a transition and building situation.
Yeah.
Maybe you can get rid of, a Draymond Jones a little early because maybe some team goes, hey, you know what? Maybe we can use him in a specialty role with us. We'll take it because we're on a Super Bowl push. And you can get Draymond Jones out because outside of that one Atlanta game, he's kind of been a no-show again. Like that goes down again as potentially one of John Schneider's worst free agent signings. Even though it was his largest, it could go down as one of his worst. And you start looking at, things like that and potential moves like that. Even if a team were to call me, and I know some Seahawks fans may think I'm nuts, but if they were to call about it like a Hankins or Jonathan or Jaron Reed, like those are guys, yes, they're depth guys, but they're guys I don't expect to be on this roster next year anyway. You're going to have to fill those voids again. Wow. Those are the type of moves I would see Seattle making. And if it's, hey, we're going to get mid-round picks for him, great, or late-round picks, or maybe you get a developmental tackle, but I don't want to see Seattle turn around and go, yeah, we're going to go get a guard that's 34, 33, like a Brandon Scherf out of the Jaguars for a rental. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, you've already gone and got theoretically a rental player in Ernest Jones with the 4th-round pick you had to acquire with that. I know we're going to get that back in a comp, but you don't need to make that trade. That was a trade you made because you thought you were potentially in a position to take the division on the uptick. Now you've come back down to earth, realize, hey, we're not really that team. We've got a lot to figure out and a lot to fix. We need to offload some of this stuff that's dead weight for this team going forward. And again, go aggressively at that offensive line. Go pay some guards. Get some guards in here.
Yeah, kind of brings up the term again, sunk costs. Like there's only so much you can do. They're just, people have been saying for a month, trade for an offensive lineman, trade for an offensive lineman. There's an offensive line problem in the league. Chris Long talked about it again on his podcast this week, just the way they're being developed in college, nobody under center. They're just not developing the power part of their game that translates to the NFL. Teams that have good offensive linemen aren't trading them. Now, you mentioned Brandon Scherf. Reportedly, the Jaguars are kind of in fire sale mode, and they are shopping him. But I think, and I'm going to play this video here, I think if the Seahawks made a move like that, as much as, man, I know if that move is made tomorrow and I go live to talk about it, overwhelmingly the fan base is going to love that move. But I think it would kind of run counter to what you've been saying all along in regards to where you think this roster is and what you're building. This was Mike Macdonald today in his press conference. I want to play this clip. He was asked a general question about where you think this team is, and I think it was interesting how he answered it and the tone that he used to answer it.
We're on our way. We're It's not where we want to be. It's not where we expected to be. But I feel like we are I think we're resilient as heck. I mean, our guys, you can just go week by week on the adversity that we faced. A lot of it is self-inflicted adversity, and great football teams don't do that. They eliminate drag. They go they go forward fast together. We're going together. We're just not going fast, right now. So it's our job as coaches to really eliminate that drag and make it clear for the guys. And we might, like I said last night, you got to go into these things with mentality that everything's kind of on the table, So that's you got to go with an open mind, open your lens up a little bit, and go back to work. So, but our guys we'll talk to them here in a minute. We'll meet today, and then we'll move forward.
I thought this was an interesting bite because, to me anyway, I heard a little bit different tone. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned on my show that I thought Coach McDonald was coming across in some of his, like the coaches show and some of his podium spots, as a little bit testy and a little bit overwhelmed. And that's a part of the job that, as a coordinator, as you're coming up the ranks and building a name for yourself to put yourself in a position to be a head coach, you don't have to do that very often. How often have we heard Aden Durde behind the podium, right? A couple times after practice, right? But not center stage like that. And so some of that is learning curve, but also this tone to me felt more comfortable in a way from Mike McDonald, that maybe he's not going to come out and tell us. He's not going to come out and say, hey, we've adjusted our expectations. This is a rebuilding team. We need to figure out the coaching staff and what schemes are going to run and have another offseason to get some players that really fit what we want to do, but we think we're close. He's not going to say that to us, but that's kind of how this felt for me. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, if you agree with that. And also, I guess the big question would be this: for anyone watching, any of the 70,000 people at the stadium or watching on TV that are diehard fans of this team and subscribers to our channels, should we as fans now take this bye week to kind of reset our expectations?
So I'll answer the first part of this for you, Dan. I found that a very interesting soundbite when I heard it today, because to me, it came across exactly kind of what you alluded to, in the sense of, I think there's been a sense of realism that has hit this coaching staff. And I think it's also hit this organization as a whole, as it was a mirage, that playoff, in my opinion, that playoff spot we got in 2021 was a luck. It was we lucked into it. We won some games maybe we shouldn't have, and we snuck in. And we've kind of had this false sense of, hey, we're better than this. We're we can push for more in the playoffs. No, we're not. We're really not. We have talent. And I think what's coming out of that, and there were a couple times he caught himself. I don't know if you caught onto that, where he kind of stopped, like he was going to say something a little bit more in depth and kind of reeled it back in.
He does that quite a bit.
Yeah. And the thing is when he said the thing about drag, and you have to keep everything open and an open mind to everything, and he widened his eyes and he kind of said, hey, we got to get a broader lens. I feel like that's a point where there may be some changes we see over this bye week that we weren't anticipating seeing. Like maybe there is a chance that they go younger on the offensive line. Like maybe there's a chance that, we see, more of Cody White out there than Jake Bobo. Like there's a lot of things that I see where I think he may be seeing too, is this was not, I hate to say this, but he came into a situation and was kind of that Jerry DiPoto situation you and me had talked about prior.
Yeah.
Where he got brought in and said, hey, can you make this roster work? And I think he's going to go back this offseason and say, I can't make this roster work. There's so many holes. There's so many deficiencies. We got to fix this offensive line, and really put John on the pressure cooker of, hey, you screwed up. Have your reset now. This is your opportunity to truly get a reset on this. And like you said too, with the fan expectation is, we've been blessed for a very long time to have a Hall of Fame level coach, Hall of Fame level talent here. And prior to that, our biggest claim to fame was the 2005 Super Bowl run with Mike Holmgren. Really, that was like our big thing, and Steve Largent and Jim Zorn. But we were kind of this okay franchise.
Yeah.
Once the LOB and Pete showed up and we went to these new heights of winning a Super Bowl, going back to a Super Bowl, being in the playoffs constantly, everyone always talking about Seattle and what they were doing in the LOB. I feel like the fan base itself kind of got this expectation, like if it's not Super Bowl, then it's a horrible season. We have to kind of go back into that Mike Holmgren era kind of thing here and look at it going, we're building an entirely new team. Even though John Schneider's carried over and there's carryover, you're going to see changes happening to the roster. And that's what I think Mike Macdonald's kind of alluding to there is they may not make a bunch of them in the trade deadline, but I think you're going to see a massive overturn of this roster, except for some core guys going forward. I think that's what he's kind of alluding to now is his expectation of where they should be and what they're doing are not going to be what everyone thought it was at the beginning of this year.
Interesting you bring up Holmgren. I've always appreciated that quote from him as well, looking back on his time here as GM and coach. But also, it took a little while for him to, that Super Bowl team wasn't built in a day either. He went 9-7 his first season, but I think 6-10 his second season. And it took him like 4 years to get back to the playoffs. It takes some time for coach, front office, player, those groups to all align. And I know that I didn't pay enough attention or give enough weight to the fact that because Macdonald was hired so late in the season, didn't get to bring a bunch of guys with him that he might have wanted to on the defensive side of the ball, primarily because most of his top assistants were given defensive coordinator jobs. But because it was so late in the process, John Schneider and he worked together to build a coaching staff, most of them from Schneider's contacts, guys he didn't know. Like they weren't involved in the draft process, the scouting process at all. Now, of course, Schneider's, going to try to get to know as much as he can about Macdonald, what he needs and wants, and go out and get it for him. Like, hey, I'm going to the store. What do you want? Right. But that's different when you're like first dating someone than when you've been married to them for a year or two. You don't need to ask, what they like, and you're going to go to the store and you're going to get it. It's, another offseason of evaluating the coaching staff and making changes as needed and getting the players that he needs for this thing to fit, I think was underestimated just a little bit. Brian Nemhauser, Hawk blogger, asked Macdonald today about his thoughts about John Schneider and building the offensive line, and that comment in the offseason that's gotten so much carry about how interior offensive linemen primarily are often overdrafted and overpaid. I think that got blown a little bit out of proportion. Macdonald's answer was interesting. He said, we're always talking about what we need and how we want to build this team. I would just tell people, and I've had to do this to myself, like calm down and take a breath. It just because it's been bad doesn't mean it'll stay bad. If Mike Macdonald is the guy you think he is, and John Schneider essentially put his career on or not his career, he'll get a job in 2 minutes if he's ever fired here in Seattle, somewhere else. But he put his tenure here on the line by hitching his wagon to Macdonald because he had conviction this guy was the dude. And so I think this next offseason, he is going to put a ton of effort and resources into building a good offensive line because he knows, A, they're going to need to win, and B, if he doesn't win, he's not going to be here much longer.
Yeah, no, I agree. And the thing that's interesting is Brian's, put his kind of question up on Twitter, and it was an interesting one because the one thing that Mike Macdonald compared it to was the inside linebackers.
Yeah.
Who have been undervalued and now are seeing a resurgence, which is true. And he said him and John have discussed all areas of the team for what they want to build. That has to be the push here. It cannot be John, even though he's in control now and doesn't have to really answer to Pete like he did before. You need to listen to this new coach who's come in with a new perspective on everything that you have built for the last decade plus. And if he's telling you it's broken, it's probably broken. Like, this isn't Pete kind of coming in and going, oh, we'll put some duct tape over it. It's not that broken, John. It's okay. Here, let's hug it out. It's Mike Macdonald's coming going like, no, the foundation of this is freaking broken. We need to fix this. Like, let's tear it down. Let's get it right. Let's go in the right direction. And that's why for me, when I said earlier on the show, like Ryan Grubb's auditioning for his job is Ryan Grubb's also auditioning to have an input on what that offensive line is going to look like going forward if he's here next year.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm saying. If this doesn't get any better and there aren't some answers that he's able to scheme into that with what he's got right now, that's why I think there could be a change where you get a veteran offensive coordinator in here and, potentially reboot the entire offensive staff or at least some of it. Cause the one name for me that I think is kind of a dark horse hire, and I said it earlier in the offseason, is I think it's Jake Peets from the Rams.
Passing game coordinator, yeah.
I think he's a sneaky thing where he may or could be your answer. If Grubb doesn't work, you turn to him. He's been in the NFL. You've seen his track record with quarterbacks and passing games and stuff, and you make him the OC and you go get a veteran offensive line coach that has a proven track record. And you move on from Scott Huff and Ryan Grubb as a whole unit because they kind of came together. So I would assume they'd kind of leave together potentially.
Yeah. All right. So we're an hour into this thing and we really haven't talked about Geno Smith. And I know some of you out there are probably like, what are you doing? Right. So let's do that. And then we'll get to some of your comments and questions out there. We got a bunch of them queued up. So just a really multifaceted game for Geno, where in some ways it encapsulated a lot of what we've seen from him in his Seahawks career. And certainly Jets fans can relate to this, what we have seen from him throughout his career. Early on, he was dogged by turnovers. It's what got him run out of the Jets and the reason he couldn't hold on to a starting spot or earn one from then on out, and kind of became a journeyman career backup until he got the opportunity here. And again, this is why I like having these conversations, because I'm in the stadium, and anyone who watches me knows that I had very similar reaction to this in the 49ers game, right? The bad pick late in the game where he's trying to hit DK on the deep slant. We find out later that DK didn't run the wrong route. He even copped to that. In the stadium, it doesn't feel like that. I don't have the benefit of the analysis. Those picks felt really bad yesterday, and they were. There's really no sugarcoating them. But if you look at each of them in a vacuum individually, there's contributing factors to all three that aren't all on him. And certainly the 60% pressure rate, he's under siege the whole game, but yet he throws for 363 yards. He has 80 yards passing. I believe that number's correct. Called back by penalties. We haven't even talked about the discipline on this team. 12 penalties yesterday. Most of them were killers. He goes 21 out of 34 here. Let's put this passing chart up. 21 out of 34, 363 yards. He's successful to all levels of the field. The big game from JSN came up with some big plays on some third and longs and some second and longs, of which there were many. I think they averaged, did I see this number right? I think they averaged over 10 yards on their third downs. That's how bad the penalty situation was. But yet he throws those back-breaking picks. But he's the only reason they have a chance to win the football game, too. Some of the throws he made, the drive at the end of the first half to give him the lead, right? Which felt like it flipped the game around. Some of the plays near the end of the game, and even in overtime, the big conversion on second and long before they get stuffed on fourth down. Like, he's making throws that not many other quarterbacks in the league can make. And yet at the end of the day, he turns the ball over 3 times in crucial situations that kills the team and their momentum. Even got away with one that he tried to force into triple coverage, but it was dropped. I know you were as hard on him as I was on Twitter and in us talking a little bit. Your overall assessment of Geno's game yesterday and just kind of where he stands right now.
So I've gone back. I've watched Geno's game. I've watched it twice. Once just watched the condensed version really quickly without all the analysis from the commentators. And then I watched the all 22. There definitely were contributing factors on those 2 red zone interceptions. However, Geno, we're not talking about a rookie quarterback here. We're talking about a guy that has a lot of playing experience.
Yeah. And
the thing for me that killed me in those with Geno was you're being flushed to your left. And I train quarterbacks. I work with quarterbacks. I'm an offensive coordinator. My rule of thumb with my quarterback is if you're getting pressure from your front side and the guy's within 2 or 3 steps of you, you need to either take off or you need to just eat that ball and just give up on that play, because what happened on the one to, I guess, JSN is who was targeted in theory, the first red zone pick, Geno's trying to throw the ball with Jared Verse bearing down on him, and Verse makes contact with his elbow on the throw, so he can't get as much on it.
Yeah.
You can't do that. Like, there's this pressure coming. Like, unless you're going to start attacking the line of scrimmage and you're able to get away, if he is said, like, he's a step or 2 within your area, like, you got to still bring that ball back and come through with the throw. You have no rotational force on that ball because your feet aren't set. So you're basically throwing with all arm strength. The slightest contact is going to completely kill that ball's velocity. Exhibit there. It went right to the defender sitting there and they take it back. And again, if he eats that ball, I think we would have been put on the 15. I believe it was second down as it was. and we would have had third down. You could have got a little bit closer, maybe had a chance to go for it on fourth, or you kick a field goal and you walk out of there with 3 points.
Yeah.
That's what killed me, is where these took place, and you have to be smart in those situations. And then the other point is on that one, if you're at the point you're backpedaling and running away from verse, then the play's dead as it is and throw the ball out of bounds. Throw it to your left and throw it and sail it out of bounds. Don't even try and throw it into the end zone where there's defenders. Like, learn to live for the next play. And I get he feels like the world is on his shoulders to make this team work. Those kill that completely.
Yeah.
Second one, Barno gets held up. And like I, was at the Washington Huskies game the night before, and the Huskies run a similar concept under Jed Fish. And they run their wide tight end across. He tries to go under the end and clear, and you dump it to him in the flat. Well, the Huskies couldn't get it going. Will Rogers, the minute any sort of obstruction happened to that guy, ball goes in the dirt, right at his feet. Geno threw that like he was still trying to complete that ball to AJ Barner. Again, throw it in the dirt. Don't try and force anything. You're in a tight game. Take the points that are there. If Seattle walks out of a combined 6 points there, that might be the difference in this game that we're talking about. And and then he goes and does what he does with the last drive of the game, which was phenomenal. He made a lot of big time throws down that, to JSN and whatnot.
Yeah,
but
that's the flip side. I mean, that touchdown to JSN in the corner on the flag route, I mean, that's as good as it gets.
Exactly. And that's where, for me, this is where I've stood with Geno, and everyone wants to talk about contract and all that. Geno is a good quarterback. He is a good NFL quarterback. He's an above average NFL cornerback. But what stops him from being in that elite category, and some people say, well, he's got a great arm and he's got an elite arm. Yes, you can talk about physical traits all you want, but when I go and pull up the quarterbacks that have the most Super Bowl rings, a lot of them weren't the most physically gifted guys, but they were elite with their decision-making at the most crucial points. And that's the thing for Geno, is he is so bad in pressure situations against good opponents that he's not consistent enough to win you those games. And in the playoffs, you're playing a Rams team, a Niners team, teams that are going to kill you for your mistakes. And when you're making those mistakes in the regular season, when the playoffs aren't on the line, that's what worries me about, having that guy. And that's why I always say Geno's the right quarterback right now for this team, the way they're currently constructed. But I don't look at Geno Smith as the guy that can go and win you a Super Bowl, because when plays like that need to be made, Geno falters. And that's where it's going to bite you in the butt. No matter how talented your team is, that is where it'll bite you in the butt come the playoffs.
And today isn't the day, at least here, for us to have the off-season conversation about what you want to do. But that concept we talked about earlier about trying to invest some resources and some cap allocation to that offensive line, bring some veterans in, probably can't accomplish that with Geno's salary on the books, ironically, because I think most fans agree that if you give that guy time to throw and you give him a really competent offensive line, we may be looking at, we most certainly would be looking at a much different one-loss record here. Got to do some things, take a break here real quick. And then when we come back, we'll get to your questions, your comments. Right after this, I'm going to send you back to the green room for a minute, buddy, and then we'll bring it back in. All right. Let's get out of this as well, you guys. Let's talk about the Chairman Pro from Manscaped. They have been sponsoring the program for a while. This is an outstanding product, brand new from them. Manscaped, trusted and used by over 11 million men worldwide. This is their electric foil shaver designed with skin-safe technology, so it won't cut you. It's got a couple of different guards that you can get with it, so you can get the fresh and clean, smooth shave. Used it right before I went on the air tonight, but you can also have up to 5 days growth. It'll handle that. You can also just cut it down to stubble if you would like as well. And right now you can get this product for 20% off plus free shipping at manscaped.com with the promo code Seahawks. Also would like to welcome a couple of new sponsors to the show. The first one is Doer. And if you've never heard of Doer, they are an apparel company, and they do some really, really impressive things. I wasn't aware of them until they came to me. Doer stands for Built for Doing. They have styles of stretch, performance, denim, and lifestyle apparel for everyone in every season. Doer clothing is sustainably crafted to last. It's antibacterial. It's temperature and moisture regulating. I've been wearing their performance denim jeans. They've got a lot of stretch to them. They're incredibly comfortable. They're really durable. And right now, this shirt that I'm wearing is their super moleskin shirt. It is incredibly soft. I'll wear it around the house. I'll wear it out to dinner with my girlfriend. Absolutely love their products. and the way they're made. It's the kind of company you want to get behind. And right now they're offering 20% off. You can go now to shopdoer.com/forever for 20% off any order. That's spelled shopdoer, DUER.com/forever for 20% off any order. Also, welcome to the show, the folks from BetterHelp. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. With Thanksgiving approaching, the month is all about thanks, right? I have a lot of things to give thanks for in my life: tremendous family, friends, job, workplace, a wonderful partner and girlfriend, a great cat who you saw in the Halloween episode. And you know, hey, as Seahawk fans, we have a lot to be thankful for, right? We love football. We're glad we have a team to follow. Win or lose, it can be frustrating, right? It can bring a lot of stress. And these days, more than ever, there's so many stressors everywhere you look around you. So it's important to take a look around and take stock of the things that matter to you and the people that we appreciate. And sometimes things get tough, and it's important to have someone to talk to about it. I know plenty of people in my life that have benefited greatly from therapy, myself included. Earlier in my life, I benefited from it as well, and I would recommend it to anyone. And now it's easier than ever. You don't even need to leave your home, right? Completely within the comfort of your own home. You could have a BetterHelp session while you're wearing your Doer clothing after shaving with Manscaped. Okay, that's a little ridiculous. But listen, I believe wholeheartedly in therapy and in this product, and it's completely online, designed to be flexible to fit your lifestyle and schedule. The ultimate convenience. You just fill out a brief questionnaire. They'll match you up with a therapist. If you don't think that's a perfect match, you can switch and get another therapist at no additional cost. Let the gratitude flow with BetterHelp, and visit betterhelp.com/forever today to get 10% off your first month. betterhelp.com/forever. Thank you for that. I appreciate you supporting the sponsors of the show. Any other way that you feel you want to support to the channel, you can find those links down below as well. All right. Thanks for that, Bryce. Let's bring you back in here. Before we get to some of our questions and comments from the viewers, I wanted to ask you one more question about Geno. Offensive line struggling. We talked earlier about maybe some things that Ryan Grubb could do in regards to maybe 12 or 13 personnel. What about moving him outside the pocket? I think Geno does that well. I think when he gets outside of the pocket improvisationally, I think he's pretty good at it. He's more mobile than we expect. I think I read today that he has the most explosive runs on this team actually throughout the season. He can make that happen, but he also throws well on the run. I think he makes pretty good decisions on the run. I don't see an effort to have an intent there to roll him out at all. Whereas if you look on the other side of the ball, we saw that with Matt Stafford, a guy who's not known as being really mobile or a guy that runs much either. And even though the Seahawks didn't have any sacks on them, there were moments when they pressured him and got close and affected the pocket. And then you saw it in overtime in particular, where they just said, screw it, we're going to roll him out of the pocket. We think this gives us an advantage and helps open some things up. Why don't they do that with Geno? Would you do that with Geno?
I would do that with Geno. And so for me, the actual guy to go look at is Jared Goff. Jared Goff and Geno Smith are very similar in their makeup, their build. I'd say Jared Goff has better decision-making, but that's just my own personal opinion, and I've seen it. But what they do, and Ben Johnson does, is because they're under center and because they run the football from under center and they mix up their formations, they're able to boot them out. Same as what Sean McVay did with Stafford. Like, even though they're not running effectively, they run these wide zones and they boot their quarterback away. Trying to move your quarterback out of shotgun, you're so limited because he's got to wait for that snap. Then you've got to slide your protection. He's got to move with it. And doing this RPO fake stuff with Geno doesn't work because Geno isn't a running threat the way Russ was. Russ, you were always worried he was going to pull it and go around the corner and he was going to get 10 yards off a run. Geno can move, but he moves when a pocket's broken down and guys are in coverage and they're chasing the receivers because they're in man and don't see him. That's where Geno's biggest runs have come off of.
Yeah.
I would love to see Geno moved. I would love to see him on boots, but that falls back onto your lack of formational diversity on this offense outside of your shotgun. We run a bunch of different formations with our receivers in shotgun. We are so limited in what we do under center, and that's what's killing us because when you look at a team like Detroit, yes, they have a great offensive line, and they built that. Detroit does not have great weapons for Jared Goff outside of the two running backs, Brown and Laporta.
Right.
They don't have a DK. They don't have a Tyler. They don't have a plethora of skill position players, but they're able to create mismatches because they can stretch the field that way off their boot and play action because they're dedicated and have a decent running game. So until that running game's fixed, you can't move Geno because every time he moves in shotgun, you know where he's going. It's a quick slide and you throw a quick flat route. That's basically about what you're going to get. There's not a whole lot you can do out of moving in the pocket when you come out of gun.
All right, let's get to some of the stuff from the viewers. Thanks to all of you for tuning in tonight. This is a fun one from Dogzilla Monster. Agree. So what, right? We all knew the Hawks would suck this year, but that game yesterday was still a lot of fun to watch. Now, I don't agree. I didn't think they would suck this year. I picked them to have, I said at the beginning of the season, I felt like it was an 11-win team. And then after the Lions loss, I actually felt so good about some of the things we saw from that. And with some of the guys coming back off injury, I actually upped that to 12 games. Obviously, that's unlikely to happen. But I like the second part of his content, that his comment, that game was fun to watch. Well, would have been fun to watch if we win, right? Those games are only fun if your team wins. But in some ways, it is kind of everything I love about football, like the ebb and flow and the back and forth. The crowd was amazing yesterday. It was, I think, from what I saw, the smallest contingent of visiting fans that we'd seen so far this year. I thought the 12s really brought it. It was a beautiful night for November. It was everything you want to see in a football game. It's just that it's amplified because, you know, it's fourth home loss in a row and it's the 5th out of 6. Otherwise, it would have been a lot more fun. I didn't feel like it was fun. Let's do this because this is something I wanted to ask you about. Steph says the team shoots itself in the foot over and over and over again in the same spot. 12 penalties yesterday, most of them killers, right? Holding calls on big pass plays, a touchdown called back, third down conversions called back. As I said, the average yard to gain on third down was over 10 yards because they just kept getting backed up. And so some of that commitment to the running game and some of the progress we saw there a little bit with their usage of Ken Walker was mitigated by the fact that they just couldn't stay disciplined. As a coach, how do you teach discipline? Do you just have to get new players? Is discipline part of being talented, or is there something you can do to reduce penalties? Because it hasn't happened so far.
It's a tough thing to deal with. When you're getting penalties at the rate Seattle's getting, you got to look at it in a couple ways. Is it a player issue, like a singular player issue? Like, is it the same guy over and over again? Like in Anthony Bradford's case, we've seen this as a trend. What type of penalties are they taking is the other part. Is it, like, for me, when it comes to holding and stuff like that, I always look at that as a lazy penalty. That means you're not moving your feet as a player and you're getting lazy. So you can hold them accountable by not playing them and benching them. But again, you know, with Seattle is you don't have the depth to put guys in to be like, okay, cool. Like back in the NLB, you could take out, you know, Richard Sherman and go, okay, we're going to put in, you know, Brandon, you know, maybe Brandon Brown or Brian Maxwell is a better example, or Deshaun Shedd, and we can get away with it for a play or two with having them in there and they're going to be okay. And, you know, Sherman will learn his lesson and he'll go back in. Can't really do that where most of our penalties are occurring are on this offensive line. Like our offensive line, 9 of the 12 penalties were on the offensive line for holding. You kind of aren't in a situation where you can just pull out Bradford and go, yeah, we're going to go put in, and you're looking down the sideline, who are we going to put in the game? Because you've scratched Lamea, you've scratched Christian Haynes. So you're going to put Sundell in there, or you know, like that's kind of where you're at. So it's one of those things where you have to healthy scratch guys and they don't play an entire game. Not like, oh, we're pulling you out for a series, get your head on straight and go back in. It's a hard thing. And I think some of it comes down to coaching too. How are your positional coaches addressing these in the meetings and stuff with guys? Like you've heard of some teams that have demerit systems where it was like, hey, every time you commit a penalty, you're giving half your paycheck up for that week's game.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dogzilla, again, the O-line sucked last year too. Where's the surprise? I think, give me your thoughts on this. I think there was an over-reliance on Abe Lucas coming back because if you recall, Mike McDonald gave us indications during OTAs that Lucas was going to be ready to go, or at least have his window open up before the season opener, at least early. Corbin Smith reported the same thing, that some of his sources were telling him that they expected Lucas to be ready to go by the start of the season and not have to start the season on the PUP list week 1. I think a healthy Abe Lucas obviously changes a lot of aspects of this offensive line, I think they overestimated that.
I think they did, and I think it's also interesting when Abe Lucas was asked that, or he made some comment about that being like, who said that I was supposed to be ready by this point or whatever it was.
A lot of people.
And that was the thing. A lot of people did say that. So, like, where's the miscommunication on where Abe thought he was versus where the sources thought he was? Abe Lucas helps you in pass protection. That's where his big thing would be. But your problem this year, yes, when Jarrell's been in there, it's been a problem. When Forsyth was in there. So, yes, your edges would get set better. But there's been such a problem on the interior of the three, of the center, the two guards, that Abe Lucas can't slide down the line and be like, okay, cool, I'm going to block Jared Verse if he had been playing in this round. I got Jared Verse and Brandon Fisk. I can take them both. Like, that's where, for me, when everyone assumed, oh, if we have Abe Lucas, this is going to make it all good and better. Abe Lucas is not the savior of this offensive line. I'm sorry. I'm going to tell that to people right now. He's not. And if you ever see him again in a Seahawks jersey, it's an added bonus. But if I'm John Schneider, this has gone on too long to be, hey, we're going to wait for next year. Like, move on, get to the next guy, find somebody else.
We're going to find out quick because his window to come off the pup ends at the 49ers game. And so now there is a possibility that, you know, just because he's not quite ready, if they feel like he's trending right and he'll be ready a week or two later, they could bring him off the pup list, but he'd have to eat a 53-man roster spot. You have to activate him, take him off that list, in which case they'd have to move somebody else. We should have won this one easy. That's what's so frustrating from Amy. I did. Again, I went on the show last week and said, hey, that Buffalo Bills loss, as bad as that looked, I think you and I maybe even talked about this a little bit. You know, the first half was a difference of 4 plays, that if they had gone differently going into the half, that game might have been a little bit different. Now, I think at the end of the day with that matchup, the Bills find a way to win that in the second half anyway, but maybe it's not a blowout. But this one, certainly, the way the defense played, the way that they basically took Kyron Williams out of this game and took Puka Nacua out of the game too in a different way. This did feel like a situation where the Seahawks didn't get beat. They lost it themselves. And I guess if you're going to take some solace, right? Like I said, I'd be positive in this one. It's that hasn't always been the case with the Rams over the last 6-7 years. There've been more than enough times that they've just come out and flat out physically beat us. That wasn't the case yesterday.
I think that's what's so disheartening about it, is that they didn't lose this game because of the Rams solely beating them.
Right.
They lost this game because they did it themselves. Like, you give back the 2 interceptions that Geno threw in the red zone and you score, say, touchdowns. That's 14 points there, right? That swings the game in a completely different direction. And now the pressure's on the Rams, which at that point in the game don't have Puka Nacua. They don't have the guy that kind of opens up their offense the way Cooper Kupp used to. Like, yes, Cooper Kupp was effective yesterday, but he wasn't killing us like he had done in previous years. There were moments, sure, he had some big catches, but that was one of the sole opportunities I looked at and went, if we can beat this Rams team, that might give us extra juice for this 49ers game.
Yeah.
Way it ended up, didn't work out that way.
Now, remember this, folks. Jake Ellenbogen, who does Rams content creation, was on the show for a preview last week. And even he said, from the outside looking in, or as our friend Jackson Bevins likes to say, the zoom out perspective, he said, look, Seahawks fans need to understand they have 3 straight games now against division opponents. They have to win 2 of those 3. Doesn't matter which 2. And again, you look at the division and how jumbled up it is right now. It's just going to feel worse because we lost the one last night. Now you have to go into the bye week. You have to sit on it. And then the task becomes a little taller because you got to come back and face a 49ers team. And basically what's almost a must-win game if you want to get to the playoffs. Ryan saying, what's up? Hope you're feeling better, buddy. Amy saying Bryce and Ryan have been such a great addition to the show, to the season. Again, if you haven't subscribed to their channel, definitely get over there and do that. Let's see. What do we got here? I'd rather be flying an X-Wing, regular contributor and viewer to the show. Feel like I'm stuck in a time loop. After every game, I'm trying to remind myself this is the first season for a new coach. Even Pete's first seasons were both 7 and 9. Another parallel that I discussed last week was look back to when Dan Quinn got his first head coaching job with the Falcons. He was hired away from the Seahawks. Seahawks made a deep playoff run that year. It was 2015. He wasn't able to be hired officially until February 2nd. He was behind the 8 ball when it came to building a staff. Missed out on some guys because they were already hired, although he had an agreement already with Kyle Shanahan, if I remember right. He had some good pieces there, obviously, and Matt Ryan and Julio Jones and some other guys. On defense, he had Grady Jarrett, but there wasn't a whole lot there. They start off 5-0, and everyone's feeling like this is the slam dunk hire. Turns out that 5-0 came against lesser opponents, combined record of 10 games under 500 by the end of the season. And then they end up losing 8 of their last 11. They finish 8-8 and miss the playoffs. Then they have that full offseason where everybody can align, get on the same page, get their nose to the grindstone, and figure out solutions based on what they now know they have. They win 11-5 that next year, ended up going to the Super Bowl, should have won it. I think that's an interesting parallel.
Yeah, it is an interesting parallel. The other one for me that, I kind of looked at, Dan, was Mike McCarthy when he took over the Packers. He took over from Mike Sherman, and they went 6-10 his first year there. And he inherited a team with talent. He had Brett Favre, he had Amon Green, Jennings, Driver. The defense had talent, AJ Hawk, Nick Barnett. But again, he got hired, had to go through that whole culture shift of taking over for a guy that had been there for 5+ years and reshape it. The next year they went 13-3, went to the NFC Championship game, and then the whole Aaron Rodgers saga began. But that's the thing I think that we're missing a little bit is if you look at coaches that have had to take over for guys that have had a long tenure and some success, it is a lot harder to shift that culture initially in that first year. Like, people always want to look at McVay and what he did with the Rams. Jeff Fisher did not have a great culture with the Rams. They were a below 500 team consistently. It wasn't like he was coming in and taking over for a guy that got them to NFC Championship games and, had a Hall of Fame resume. No one's looking at Jeff Fisher that way.
Yeah.
But when you look at Pete Carroll, people look that way. You look at, Mike Sherman had a very successful run with the Green Bay Packers there during his time as a Packers head coach. Mike Smith had a very successful run of getting to an NFC Championship game and deep in the playoffs with the Falcons and Matt Ryan in that group. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing I think we got to take into consideration with this Mike Macdonald is he is going to have to come in and change what Pete did. And yes, there's elements they want to keep, but it's going to take a little bit of time. And maybe that means changing out coordinators. They didn't work this time. I got to go get more NFL veteran guys in here.
Another comment from X-Wing, 2 back-to-back that I think work together. He said, they kept saying during the offseason, we don't know what we're good at. Maybe this is naive, but wouldn't you use a scheme that plays into your team's strengths? If your O-line is all good at power, then run power. He follows that up with this. Why the hell on 4th and run are we not running a quarterback sneak? Feels like the running backs are consistently getting handed the ball 4 to 5 yards behind the line, and then they have no time. In overtime, the Seahawks are driving. Geno gets the big play to, was it Cody White? Or am I thinking of a different drive? Was it Cody White or was JSN? So they have a chance, right? They win the toss. You score a touchdown, regular season overtime rules. You get a win. Everyone's feeling a lot better, even despite the issues on offense. You have a 3rd and 1, or was it 3rd and 2? And they decide to go for it on 4th and 1 instead of kicking the field goal and hoping that your defense can get another stop, because there were so many times throughout this game where they stood up and got stops and got 3 and outs and got the Rams off the field. No creativity. You go back twice to X-Wing's point to something that hasn't really worked for you. I've always judged 4th down calls at my core, like, I love the aggressiveness, but I always try to ask myself before the play is executed, regardless of the outcome, do I like this call and what would I do with it? How did you feel about the 2 calls there back to back, and what would you have done differently?
So the first one on the 3rd down and 2, my biggest issue was, why are you asking JSN to try and block an edge or a linebacker on that run? Doesn't make sense. He doesn't have the weight for it. He's not that type of receiver. That's where a Cody White or a Jake Bobo that you have on these rosters, that's what a big receiver is meant for. Go make that block. Go seal that off. I don't even want to talk about Pharaoh Brown, because to me, he's been a waste of money since we've got him. He's just been a complete disaster. And you're putting a guy that's not really a fullback in a fullback role in Brady Russell. Brady Russell isn't a fullback. He's a tight end.
It was almost just for show. Like,
it's like, hey, look, we're in a, and then
anything.
Yeah. Exactly. And then you go to 4th down and you take all your receivers off the field and you tighten this whole thing up. You don't have the lineman to run a power dive in that situation. That's where you might want to pull the team out and go with like a jet or something that's creative that you can use to your advantage, like a Laviska Shenault on a swing, or hey, we're going to fake it and we're going to dump it in the flat or something. But like, you don't have big boy guys to go run that play. And that's what killed me on that. It was like, why are we doing the same thing we can't do and get, like, we're just bad at it. Don't do it.
Yeah. Or sneak it. I mean, you have a 6'3" quarterback who's like, I don't understand the reluctance to try and sneak it. And then Ryan Grubb's history at Washington, God dang it. I know this so well from the Apple Cup 3 years ago against my Cougs at Husky Stadium. Like, they were pretty aggressive. They went forward on 4th down a lot. Grubb and DeBoer did. And he was so creative, if I thought what they were going to do, honestly, and it could have been a disaster, but it didn't work out anyway. They packed everybody in. I thought for sure we were going to see some sort of naked bootleg, right? Get him outside and sneak somebody out in the flat, and he could run for it if it wasn't there. I was just shocked they just handed it up the middle again. It reminded me, I know there were some times, there's a game I'm thinking of in particular, but I can't remember who it was against or when it was, where the Seahawks had 1st and goal on the 1 or 2 yard line. Was it Cincinnati last year? Where they just tried pounding it up the middle 4 times.
Yeah, Cincinnati.
Yeah. It reminded me of that. I mean, Mike McDonald, Ryan Grubb aren't the only people that have made that mistake. That was really, really frustrating at the time, because you just felt, even though we were holding them in check, and even though that defense deserves a lot of kudos for how they played yesterday, gosh darn it, we just let him off the hook. And it's still, at the end of the day, it's Matt Stafford. And it just, he played that last drive like he had a plane to catch. Like, he's like, I'm over it. I'm done. Three out of 4 plays, 3 big passes from Stafford. Game was over. Ryan Grubb only knows how to run shotgun. You've talked about this a lot with me. I haven't, in the stadium, I thought early on, especially, they played with tempo a little bit early, still didn't really help. They got off to another poor start. But I did note there were some times in the game that I saw them under center. Did they use it a little bit more yesterday? Did you see maybe some signs there?
A little bit, but nothing to the point that it would make a defense change. And that's the whole thing. I've always been a component, and you have some offensive coordinators that love to have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of plays. I've always been a component of, I don't need a lot of plays. I need to have my core plays, but I need to have a lot of formations to make it look different, because a defense doesn't know what you're really running. They're assuming based off looks of what you do, this is what they like to do in these situations. Well, if I can run, 15 core pass concepts out of 15 formations that vary from under center to shotgun to this to that, it's all going to look different, even though it's the same play over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And that's where, for me with Ryan Grubb, is every team expects us. You watch how ends play us. Ends don't shoot inside a lot. They're always outside, pinning their ears back. Okay, Geno's going to take his 3 steps out of gun. This is our, point of impact on Geno. This is where we need to get to. It makes it hard on a quarterback when you always know that the DNs are coming off the edge hard, and teams know that, hey, to run that play, it's going to take time to, get the ball from the quarterback or center to quarterback if he gets it. And then to your running back, even if you want to run a run play, like running out of gun is very hard if you don't have a dual threat quarterback.
I'm going to pick on someone just a little bit. Sorry about this, but it can't all be roses and rainbows. 36090 P. Burke, James Carpenter, John Moffitt, J.R. Sweezy, Jermaine Ifedi, Justin Britt, Ethan Posick, Anthony Bradford, etc. John sucks at drafting O-line. First of all, I think J.R. Sweezy was an undrafted free agent who had never played offensive line. He was a Tom Cable project. This is cherry picking to me. He's drafted some really good offensive linemen, right? He drafted a Hall of Famer, right?
He did.
And he's done pretty well in certain spots. Russell Okung and now we're seeing Charles Cross, but Steve Hutchinson, and he had Max Unger before he traded him away. I mean, he's done okay. And that leads me to this one too. Here he is. Card Crazed says JS publicly said he doesn't want to spend on the trenches. In the last few years have shown that to be wrong. I hope he wakes up, smells the coffee, and gets trench guys. I've been hammering away at this for a while. He didn't say he doesn't want to spend on the trenches. That's not what he said. He said typically interior offensive line get drafted higher and paid more than he thinks they should. That doesn't mean he doesn't want them. I took that to mean that there's probably some guys he wanted at certain points in the draft some years, and he thought they were going to be there and they were gone, and he was surprised by it. Or that in the offseason, There might have been guys that he wanted to target. I mean, TJ Lang, famously, we thought he was on the way here. They offered him a ton of money. He turned it down. The guy from the Chargers, Dielman, who made undrafted free agent, made himself into a Pro Bowler. Schneider tried to get him, offered him a ton of money. He wanted to finish his career with the Chargers. He hasn't ignored it. Rob Staten was on your show last week and said that, look, Robert Hunt is a good player. Would love to have him on this roster, but not for 5 years and $100 million. Heck no. A lot of people have said maybe we should have kept Damian Lewis. And in hindsight, the money that we saved by not re-signing him didn't get spent very well, right? You mentioned Pharaoh Brown. Jerome Baker obviously didn't work out. But I don't know that Damian Lewis was worth the money that the Panthers gave him either. So I just wanted to clear that up. That wasn't the intent of Schneider's comment.
No, it wasn't the intent of it, but that's where I feel like John should be smarter in how he publicly makes statements like that. And the thing that I'll say, we look back at, when the Seahawks had a good running game, and this is something I kind of didn't get a chance to talk to or point out earlier. The NFL made a rule change. I think it was 2016, I want to say, or 2017. They made a change that you couldn't cut block downfield. Tom Cable's running scheme and his zone scheme was so predicated on his O-line being able to cut downfield on their zone. And that's where you saw their zone system work so well, is they could cut a guy a couple yards downfield. You can't do that anymore. And that's where, when you saw that rule change come in, you started to see Seattle and Tom Cable's zone scheme struggle. Then they went to Mike Solari and the power scheme, and we got DJ Fluker and Mike Apati and all those guys. And it kind of came back a little bit, but that change in the NFL rule made a massive change to how Seattle ran the football and how they drafted linemen, because that's what J.R. Sweezy was good at. J.R. Sweezy was, like you said, a undrafted D lineman convert to O-line, that his best thing was he could run downfield and be athletic and cut a guy. That's what he was so good at. Yeah. So, it is cherry picking a little bit on saying his things, but the problem with that, honestly, Dan, and the reality is name linemen that John Schneider has drafted that have made you go, wow, we really nailed that pick.
Right. Or as you said earlier, we're, given a second contract. There just hasn't been that continuity. Absolutely. I didn't mean to defend him by showing that comment. I just wanted to, point out the other side of it. You need to go, right?
A couple minutes. I've got a couple more minutes here.
Okay, cool. And then let me know when you do, because I know you got a show with Mookie Alexander, a field goal is coming up. You guys definitely check that out. And then I'll stay on a little bit after you have to go, and I want to get through these and reward the people who have watched the show and get to as many of these comments as I can. But let me see here. This is an interesting one. I think even the conditioning coaches are horrible also. Tons of injuries. Hawks haven't had a healthy team. JS needs to wake up and get O-line. Why not trade for sure? Okay, there's a lot going on there. It was the first part of the comment, though, that it is, and I'm not so sure that it's any better or worse or different than when Pete Carroll was here. He was kind of famous for being a little overly optimistic on the injuries. There seems to be some disconnect with what the training team is communicating to McDonald, what he communicates then and passes on to us, and what's actually happening. He made it sound, again, we talked about the Lucas thing, right? Here we are 10 weeks into the season, and there was a lot of people who felt like he was going to be ready to go at the beginning. The DK thing, it didn't, he kind of poo-pooed it at first. Didn't seem like it was going to be that bad. Think he's going to be able to go. And now, he ends up missing 2 games. What's your experience with working with some of these conditioning guys? And I know there's a lot of pressure. It's not an exact science, right? You might think a guy's trending well. He wakes up the next day, he regresses. How much accountability can we put on strength and conditioning coaches in the NFL for teams that tend to seem to have lingering injury issues? Because in my view, it seems to be happening to everyone.
Yeah, it's kind of an odd thing. So from a coaching perspective, you rely on these guys a lot to tell you where guys are, when they're coming back from their injuries. And a part of it is you have your conditioning team, and then you usually have your medical, physical therapy team on the other side that they work with your conditioning team. So the guys basically get given the players after they've rehabbed their injury, they get given to conditioning, and you kind of got to ramp them up and work in conjunction with each other. I've noticed since Seattle brought in, I can't remember his name, but he's from USC. He was from Pete's days at USC, and he's been the guy for the conditioning team for a while. That there's constantly been an issue on when players are healthy and when they're not, when they're ready to go. And there's also been a string of we have guys getting hurt more frequently in certain particular things than other teams. So it may be something they can look at. I'm not a whole soul believer in that's on the conditioning staff. I think it's more of you've got your conditioning, your physical therapy, your rehab teams. They all have to work together on to get these guys back and ready to go on the field. And maybe, tests show one thing, but then on-field tests show something else. So it's kind of a hit and miss.
Yeah. This is interesting from Colombo. He says, I don't see McDonald letting JS overpay DK, pay the guards. The money has to come from somewhere, right? It's not DK that the salary that needs to get off the payroll. It's Tyler Lockett. And I think one of the underrated storylines from yesterday's game is, as much as we all love Tyler, I was wearing his number at the game yesterday, right? He's a legend. He's a Ring of Honor guy. We know what a person he is. I think yesterday pointed out, as much as any game we've seen, without DK Metcalf even on the field, and what a minimal role Tyler Lockett played in that game, that it's going to be really hard, if not impossible, to justify carrying his salary in the last year of his deal next year when there are so many other needs.
No, I totally agree. To me, this is Tyler's I've been saying it all along. I think this is his last year in Seattle. I think he either retires or they cut him. But you could tell he didn't have an impact. Yes, he had a couple catches yesterday, and yes, some of them were great. It was a back shoulder throw. They were over 10 yards, but I didn't feel Tyler's impact like I felt Tyler's impact in the last, even in that game against the Saints a few years ago where he's catching 2 deep posts and stuff like that. I haven't seen that from Tyler. Yes, he got open on the offside down the sideline. But there's 2 contracts in my mind that need to come off the books, and that's Draymond Jones and Tyler Lockett next year.
Yeah. Nate says, I'd like to see Howell. I mean, you knew this was coming, right? He should get a chance. I know the O-line is weak, but here's his reasoning for this. He says, I think Howell can move around more faster than Geno. Now, I would disagree with this in the sense that, Howell is mobile and he's pretty creative on the move. We saw him have to do that in Washington last year, and he did it against us. We saw him get outside the pocket and kill us with a couple of big plays. But I bet if you put Geno and Howell together and had them run a 40 against each other, Geno kicks his ass. Geno's athletic.
Geno is athletic. Geno is I think has a better long distance. I think Howell might be more explosive in short areas.
How bad would things have to get these last 8 games for you to go to Howell?
I think if Seattle loses their remaining divisional games, so the 49ers and the 2 Cardinal games, which are in the span here of 4 weeks after the bye. You have the Jets smushed in between those 2 Cardinals games. If you lose 2 of those and you go 2-2, so that would put you at what? That'd put us at 6-7. Your playoff shot is almost kind of gone at that point. Like it really is. It's pretty much, because then you're coming up against the Packers, the Vikings at home, and then you got the Bears and Rams on the road. I think you'd have to lose the next 4 games for Howell to be an actual legitimate option for the rest of the year. I am interested if they are mathematically eliminated from the playoffs to have, Howell not get some reps. But here's the thing, and this is the one thing I will say about this. If you turn to Howell at any point before it's like the last game of the year and you want to see something or whatever it is, you are basically signaling to everyone that you are not bringing Geno back next year.
Yeah.
That is what that signals. If you put Howell in and play him for a substantial period after the Cardinals' second game that we have here, which I can't remember the date off the top of my head, and he's up against the Packers, the Vikings, Bears, and Rams, 4 games to end the year, you have signaled the end of the Geno Smith era, because that tells me you are not going to re-sign or extend that guy when you've turned to him at that point.
Colombo says 60 yards and a touchdown. It was pretty impactful. My point with the Tyler Lockett thing, and you even touched on it, the touchdown, the big play, most of his production was off on defensive offsides and Geno taking a shot. He was wide open. But he wasn't a big part of the game plan at all in any way, shape, or form. Let's see. I think that's pretty much what we have, man. Thanks for joining me and helping talk me through this, and hopefully some of the fans out there feel a little bit better. I think at the end of the day, and also one thing I want to say before you go, can't let this guy off the hook, right? I think he's had a solid season. I think he's one of the better kickers in the league. But if Jason Myers makes that extra point on the first score, it's a different game. And I usually don't like to play that revisionist history game because, sometimes a failed score, a touchdown taken off the board from a penalty or something like that, or a fumble can completely alter how the game script would go after that. But this one's pretty tough to defend. He makes that extra point. I don't think it changes anything that happens afterwards. And the Seahawks are playing for a win there at the end of regulation instead of a tie. So can't let him totally off the hook.
It's interesting for me because the one thing I saw in that Jason Myers kick that I initially didn't see until I saw the all 22 was, once again, a team busted the right A gap on the Seahawks PAT unit, and you had a guy in his face with his arm up that he did kick wide of. And that's another guy that we haven't talked much about, and I'll leave it with this: was it a smart move to get rid of Larry Izzo and bring in Jay Harbaugh as special teams coordinator?
Yeah, although I feel like that unit's getting better. I mean, the block punt was huge yesterday. Should have been bigger, because if they are able to capitalize on it, don't turn the ball over right back to them. But yeah. Thanks, man. Everybody, when they're done here, and I'll wrap things up after I let them go, should head on over to the HawkZone Rundown channel on YouTube and watch. You going to go live with that with Mookie?
We are going live with that. It's a live show. It's our spinoff show with Mookie Alexander from Field Goals, called Pulse of the Hawks. So Mookie's going to come in and give us his perspective on everything. We've got some topics, so bring your questions, your comments in over there.
All right, man. I'm going to let you go. Get ready for that. Say hi to Mookie for me, and hopefully Ryan will be feeling better soon. You guys will be back on the air together again soon.
We will be back together on the 9th of November for our roundtable.
All right, man. I appreciate you.
Go Hawks.
Sorry, I just got to click the mouse a few times, you guys. Yeah, that's going to do it for me here. Shout out to BetUS for sponsoring this episode. Some things I have coming up over the next couple of weeks. Going to kind of dive into some specifics, right? Look at some individual performances, but also take advantage of the bye week and zoom out and take a bigger picture look at not just this team, the 2024 Seahawks, but the organization as a whole and kind of where they're headed. And so, you know what that means? That means we're going to take a look at the salary cap. And I'll do an episode on what moves can be made between now and next year to clear up a certain amount of cap space. I think you'll be encouraged after you see some of those exercises. The first mock draft of the year, right? We're officially like halfway. I mean, the bye kind of comes at a time for the Seahawks where they're just past the halfway point, but let's call it the halfway point of the season. What are some of the biggest needs as we look forward to the draft next year, and kind of where does the class line up with those weaknesses, and how can the Seahawks address some of them in the first 3 or 4 rounds of the draft? We won't go 7 deep. It's too early for that. And then after the weekend, as we get into 49ers week, Max Brown, who does such a wonderful job, the ex-USC and Pitt quarterback who's from the Pacific Northwest and Skyline High School, and does a great job calling games for the CW and also providing content and analysis online. We're going to talk about this 2025 quarterback class and just the general scope of developing quarterbacks from college to the NFL, why so many of them are failing so quickly, why teams are moving on from them so quickly, and how that combined with college quarterbacks being able to, and players of any position being able to make some money now, is affecting quarterback availability. And as we start to look forward, how it's a little bit harder to gauge what's coming up. Also, not current number 29, Devin Witherspoon, but former number 21 Paul Moyer, who does, a bunch of broadcasting for the Seahawks pre and post game shows, friend of the show. He's going to come back on and give us his thoughts on how the Seahawks sit during this bye week, and also get into some specifics of the secondary play. And that's when, if you think tonight we didn't talk enough about Reek Woolen's performance, because I think he did deserve more conversation. Couldn't fit it all in, and I'm anxious to get Paul's view of what he thinks of Reek's development, and just what was a very, very up and down roller coaster, good and bad game yesterday against the Rams. Shout out to all the sponsors on the program. Any way you want to support the program, all those links are down in the description. Follow me on Twitter, of course, at Seahawks Forever. Thanks, you guys. Really appreciate the engagement and the involvement. Be sure to subscribe to the channel. Until next time, I'm Dan. Forever and always, go Hawks.